Hello and welcome to Monbiosis again on COP26.tv. And today we want to talk about, well, an issue which scarcely anyone wants to talk about, which is the massive impacts of wealth on the world. Now, the rich people say we're wealth creators, but when you look at the situation in ecological terms, it seems to me that by helping themselves to the lion's share of resources, they're not creating wealth, they're taking it away from other people. And recent analysis by Oxfam shows that the top 1%, their emissions are twice those of the poorest 50% of humanity. And indeed, they consume 15% of all current carbon. And that is obviously simply unaffordable. Well, we're very lucky to have three people who can talk about all aspects of finance and wealth, where they relate to climate breakdown. We have Esther Stanford-Josai from the Stop Manganese movement. We have Chidi Obahara, and we have Sophie Cohen. I'm going to ask them all to explain their work in a moment. But we're really lucky to have three of the world's top experts in this region. Chidi, can you start us off and tell me, please, about the work you do?
Thanks very much, George. So my name is Chidi Obihara. I've advised XR on banking and markets issues for a few years now. But before that, my career background is in investment banking. I ran a small desk at Morgan Stanley in fixed income. I worked in banking for about 20 years in the City of London. And to contextualize what George is saying, it's an extremely important debate. It's very difficult to overstate it. We keep having these arguments about, who's really responsible for the hole that we find ourselves in. The Keeling curve has gone up from a 280 parts per million pre-industrial level to 415 or more now. And the key question is, what took us from the average levels of carbon in the atmosphere to these stratospherically high and very dangerous levels of carbon in the atmosphere? And we all know it's an industrial revolution that was started in Western Europe. And we all know that the destruction of ecosystems around the world, especially in the global south, has accelerated this horrible tragedy we find ourselves in. So there's a wealth effect. There is an actual accumulation of private wealth that has been created at the expense of our joint global common wealth, as it were. The wealth that nature creates on its own is something that all of humanity is supposed to share. And when you shred that, in this particular case, literally, to create private wealth in the way that you do, and then you end up with this horrible carbon deficit, if you want to call it that, you have to call out those who are responsible for getting us into this position and tell them that the rights that they have acquired in the process of acquiring so much wealth have to be balanced out by the responsibilities of dealing with that problem. The adjustment and transition process cannot be balanced on the backs of the poor, who are the victims of this process, not the cause of it.
Thank you very much, Chidi. Esther, tell us about your work and what you're trying to do to change the world.
Sure. I'm a reparationist, which is a reparations campaigner and activist. I say a system change reparationist because when people hear that word reparations, they always reduce it to money and financial compensation. And reparations is about fundamentally stopping harm and repairing harm. And that requires system change. So the work I do in the Stop the Manganese We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign is about linking historical movements for reparations with the contemporary concerns of our world, looking at the fact that the harm that has been done has not only been done to people, but our planet and the very, Mother Earth that sustains all life. So that's the work that we do. And it is really about linking with movements who are, struggling to resist forms of domination today, but also create the alternative, which is really the true repair.
And Sophie, Switch It Green, that's what you're working with. Tell us something about this.
Sure. Hi, thanks for having me. So my work really, it began in Extinction Rebellion, where I set up and coordinated the media team. And since then have been so passionate about getting people to understand that they can make a difference themselves. So it's really about empowering people to take an action, an individual action that is impactful. in the fight against climate change. So with Switcher.green, we set it up a few months ago, and it's very simple. It's research that we've done into banks and energy companies and soon to be pensions in the UK and the US. We've collated all this information and we've created a tool through which you can see if your bank or your energy company is funding fossil fuels. And if it is, we show you ways that you can move your money out. The idea is that we're running switch campaigns, the next one on the 1st of December, which is about mass individual action for systemic change, empowering individuals to use the power that they have in their pocket, knowing that banks, since the Paris Agreement, have put 2.7 trillion into fossil fuels, and that awareness of that problem is just like it's not very high. So we're about increasing the transparency and holding large financial institutions to account.
Chidi, governments agreed in the Paris Agreement to address the issue of the financing of climate breakdown. How far have they gone in that direction?
That's an exceptionally good question. So you're absolutely right. The Paris Agreement has two apparently conflicting articles as far as this COP is concerned. So Article 2.1c is the bit of the Paris Agreement which says we're supposed to align global capital flows, that is the money that we spend and the way that it goes, towards the commitments that all the countries have made in their NDCs. In other words, you're not supposed to carry on pouring capital into high carbon existing businesses, or worse, starting new high carbon businesses anywhere in the world. The Paris Agreement effectively says that in 2.1c. There's a different article, Article 6, which talks about carbon markets, be they voluntary or otherwise, and pricing carbon uniformly around the world. Now, these two articles have been really the bones of contention in this particular COP, because while some members of the Conference of Parties appear to be happy to ignore 2.1c because it imposes obligations on them, other members are obsessed with Article 6 because they think it gets them the right to execute a singular carbon price around the world and extract profit from its trading. Now, the real problem with that latter thing is that in every form of taxation, applying one price to every income group around the world is incredibly difficult and probably potentially impossible without a rebate system, because there's no way it is ever going to be fair to charge a working mother in Bangladesh the same amount for carbon through her supply chains as you do a wealthy billionaire in Sweden. You don't need to go to university or have a degree in economics to figure out that a single carbon price for the planet is extremely ambitious and probably just a wholly wrong process without, first of all, doing a gigantic amount of groundwork and changing the context in which we all work and live on this planet. So, in summary, to answer your question directly, this particular COP is focused on different parts of the Paris Agreement and making them balance out in a way that is very difficult for observers from the outside to understand. But what you have to kind of take in is that if you're going to have tradable carbon markets and a fixed carbon price, you have to do a lot of work, first of all, to deal with inequality, to make sure the transition is a lot more just than it is right now, and to give voice to the voiceless, where so many powerful countries and corporates are willing to trade and bargain on things that aren't clear to the general public.
Thank you, Chidi. And Esther, if we were to do as Chidi says, to deal with inequality, to give voice to the voiceless, that would take us some way towards the reparations that you were discussing. What else needs to be done?
So I think fundamentally people need to understand what reparations mean as advocated by African heritage communities and other communities of resistance in the global south. It is about fundamentally, transforming the way that we relate, not only to each other, but we relate to our home, in terms of so-called economy, which is about how we manage the resources of Mother Earth in a way that is equitable, sustainable, and regenerative. So I believe what needs to happen is that we need to rethink the way that we actually relate to each other, the way that we define success, the way that we define progress, the way that we define so-called development, and all of that needs to fundamentally change if we are to have a system change approach to reparations, as opposed to just arguing for loss and damage kind of calculations, which reinforce the very system that is promoting actually a death style rather than a lifestyle.
Yes, I think that's very well put. But you know, while you quite rightly say it's the systemic change we need, at the same time, there does need to be significant money transferred, doesn't there? But by the rich countries, and they have promised to do so. How well are they keeping those promises, and are the promises adequate anyway?
Well, no, the promises are not adequate, but the issue about transferring, and this is the problem about just thinking that the reparations is about transferring resources from the north to the south. If the south itself is locked in a global economic system that promotes what we refer to as the Maangamizi, and actually the mechanisms for climate financing end up going to reinforce that very system, then that is not effectively repaired. So there needs to be the self-repair, the institutional repairs, the creation of new financial institutions as well in the global south. And in fact, in the 70s, reparationists in global south countries were arguing for a new economic political order. That is really the context of structural repair, even in terms of reformist measures. And we're not hearing enough about that. In certain countries in Abya Yala, so-called South America, they are, using alternative indices such as Buen Vivir and other notions of what it means to live well and actually to live sustainably, that actually reinforce indigenous knowledges and worldviews and cosmovisions about how we relate to our earth, our Mother Earth.
Esther, can I just ask you, what is the meaning of the term Maangamizi?
Maangamizi is a Kiswahili term that means the African holocaust, we would say, but it's a continuum of chattel, colonial, and neo-colonial forms of enslavement. So that's when we say stop the Maangamizi, it's really saying we need to stop that system, which actually hasn't just impacted African people, indigenous peoples, it's actually infected the whole planet and all of humanity.
Sophie, can we move towards stopping that system? I know you're not proposing a complete answer, but if is what you're proposing, which is basically a sort of voluntaristic approach, can that actually address some of the structural issues which Esther and Chidi have raised?
Thanks, George. Yeah, so as we know, economic and financial systems are driven by GDP. They totally ignore the environmental and social externalities that are so vital. I'm not proposing that one way is going to solve everything. And I think this is where we always need a tapestry of action in order to really shift the narrative. So much of this is about awareness. So much of it is about empowerment. And from our perspective, in the kind of divestment movement, it's really about bringing in people to the conversation. So making it clear to your average person in the UK or the US, because that's what we focus on now, that they actually are responsible for their choices, and to not act is a choice. So we're trying to, I think within the divestment world, there's also brilliant campaigns such as Market Forces and Share Action, who are working a little bit more on the inside of banks and financial institutions to force them to change in response to shareholder pressure. From the Switch-It.Green side, we're about current accounts, soon to be business accounts and savings accounts. So this is kind of the beginning of the journey to demonstrating that we can make change from our pockets. And with these varying campaigns, all sort of putting pressure, and it's kind of like a pincer movement, the increase in awareness that these campaigns create is devalues the banks, not necessarily only financially, but also in their brand value, essentially in the trust that people have in these banks. one of the most worrying things, but also partly why we're here, that I've seen in the last sort of year, is that out of HSBC customers and Barclays customers, 4 out of 5 have said they're interested in tackling climate change and protecting the environment, but only 1 in 5 of those customers of HSBC and Barclays are aware that their banks invest in fossil fuels. So this is the shift we need to see, is awareness of the destruction that these organisations are doing.
Thank you, Sophie. Sophie makes a very strong case there, Chidi, but part of the problem we face is the free riders. And really what we're talking about there are the ultra rich people who are just saying, I'm going to grab what I can and burn as much carbon as I like and fly my private jet and travel around in my super yacht. What do we do about that? What do we do about the massive disproportionate emissions of the ultra rich?
That is an exceptionally good question, George. Thank you so much for asking it. And I say that because all of the narrative that most people are taught at school, at university, business schools, to pump out hundreds of thousands of young people every year, who are told there's something called the tragedy of the commons, which sort of hypothesizes this sort of situation where there's commonly owned land and us, bad, common people, we overuse it, we trash it, we do bad things to it because we don't know any better. And this is the framework from which policymakers are taught to look at these things. But this framework, we know, factually, empirically, is wrong. The real issue is a tragedy of the incumbents. It's the powerful who own and control the system, who limit and change our choices at their whims for their profit, who are causing the overuse of our commonly held resources, who are not allowing a polluter pays principle to be actualized in policy, in action, and at conferences like the COP. When you're in a situation where the top 1%, by some measures on a per capita basis, I think it is, are responsible for up to 30% of the carbon footprint on this planet, the rest of us, 99%, can't then be described as random free riders. It's the number 1%, it's that group who limit our choices, who create system constraints, who seem to be very comfortable with watching us go through, a global pandemic caused by animal rights abuse and natural space invasion, who watch us go through that, come out of it, and rather than affect any kind of system change, insist they want business as usual, insist they want fossil fuels to burn even more, and then pretend as though they don't know how we got here and point the finger in every direction except at themselves. It's the most ridiculous hypocrisy. And what was worse, we had to listen to the G7 just before the COP26 come out, announce a victory. I can't begin to tell you just how Pyrrhic this apparent victory is supposed to be, a victory whereby the G7, who are themselves responsible for most of the carbon in the atmosphere, announce a victory that's supposed to be based on the fact that they will no longer fund overseas coal. As though to say there was some group of people somewhere very far away who are responsible for what's going on and we're going to stop them, wearing a cape and going out there, when actually they are the ones who are responsible for this mess. It's just incredible. I know they have great PR, I know they have wonderful lobbyists, but really we aren't that stupid anymore. They need to stop treating us that way.
That's beautifully put, Chidi. Thank you very much. And Chidi, Esther talks about the crucial role of narrative, the way that we construct these stories. And of course, the colonial narrative in some ways remains a very powerful one, doesn't it? Sort of like, the European nations went out to rescue the world from its backwardness. That's the story which was so often being told, and it still seems to be there, that narrative, doesn't it?
Well, that narrative is there, but it's not just a narrative, it's the actual practice. And the remnants of that is what's known as coloniality that remains in the institutions, the very systems that have been globalized and internationalized. And so that's why for us as reparationists, it does begin with changing the narrative, but it's also about changing the paradigm through which that we're operating. And actually redefining, who are the real saviors. We save ourselves. And we've always done that through our processes of liberation struggle, which have ended up not only, transforming ourselves, but influencing and impacting on other people's liberation struggles as well. And so that is the first thing. It is about changing the narrative, changing the way that the relationship. And the biggest relationship in the context of the COP that we need to change is the way that we relate to Mother Earth and nature. We need to change that old domination paradigm, which even those of us who have been colonized have internalized to some degrees in terms of survival and being forced to be locked into a system that continues that domination paradigm. And that's why the true repair begins with that self-emancipation and actually our right to re-envision who we are as human beings and who our relations are, not just as human beings, but our relations are also all nature, all living life forms, you know, on planet Earth. And that for us is what we refer to as planet repairs, because we need to change that old mindset of domination to one where we live, you know, in harmony and equilibrium again, which is what Indigenous peoples have been showing the way for centuries. So when we're listening, if we truly listen, we know that land back is just as much about reparations, because the Indigenous peoples who've been controlling, actually not controlling, stewarding Earth's resources sustainably for centuries, who have been denied access to be vicegerents over lands which is being extracted. That's part of the problem that we're trying to actually stop today.
Beautifully put, thank you. Now, Sophie, I know that you and Esther need to go in a couple of minutes, so I'm going to just ask you very quickly to say one more thing, and then you two can go, and I'll turn to Chidi to finish off the program with us. So Sophie, Esther gave a really clear and beautifully expressed picture of the shift that we need to make. You feel that we can make part of that shift here at home, even within our existing financial structures. Is there a danger of moral hazard here that we could say, well, we can reform those structures by sort of shifting our investments and putting pressure on them, whereas possibly it is the entire infrastructure of finance which is at fault, and perhaps we need to be looking at overthrowing it?
I totally understand where you're coming from there, George, and with my Extinction Rebellion hat on, yes, let's overthrow it. With my Switch It Green hat on, let's try and change it from the inside. I believe we can try and do both at the same time, because we've got to start somewhere. And I know that certain people might not be ready to say this financial system needs to completely change. They need to understand that through starting to engage with it more. So it's really a process of engagement in understanding what it is that needs to change. And I don't believe the kind of like reform versus revolution narratives, they overlap. There's a Venn diagram there, I believe. And so for me, the most important thing is engagement of people in the problem. And so that's what we're trying to do with Switch It Green. Once you engage people in that narrative, then who knows where they could go with understanding more about where the problem comes from. But I guess what I'm talking about really is meeting people where they are and then bringing them on a journey to understanding on how we can change collectively, because it's really collective action that makes a difference.
Thank you, Sophie. That's very clear. Well, Sophie and Esther, thank you so much for joining us. We'll let you get on now. But I really appreciate your brilliant contributions to this program. Thank you. So Chidi, we've heard these very clear expositions of where things are going wrong. We've heard something about what needs to be done. What would a fair and green world look like?
Again, an amazing question. So firstly, I think that the journey to this place is just as important as the place itself, right? And you're in Glasgow on a crisp winter morning, dressed the way that you are, so you keep the cold out, talking to the world about what needs to happen. And your voice is a spectacular, incredible, influential, much loved voice, George. And I think that this is where the journey starts. We need a small band of people who are willing to speak truth to power. Because as I said to Roger Hallam a little while ago, telling the truth in this particular time and place is an act of pure unmitigated revolution, because we're working with policymakers who only get away with what is, gross negligence, because the truth is not in the public domain. It's not in the public space. So I think we start by telling the truth. The rest of the journey includes, pointing out things that are deliberately sort of cast in a way that ordinary members of the public who want to see change can't identify with. So, for example, this morning, the Telegraph, actually, the Telegraph, the Tory Graph, posted on Twitter, or rather, I reposted on Twitter a feed from the Telegraph about the things that we can do as individuals that make a difference. And with some of them, if you stop eating meat, twice a week, if you stop using your car twice a week, if you stop doing really quite mundane things about 25% of the time, you can, as an individual, get us closer to 2030 as a net zero date, which is what we need. We can't. 2050 is too late. But crucially, I think we need to arm people with the knowledge, the information, and fora like this, so they can challenge COP. Something really radical happened, believe it or not, at The Economist magazine, that well-known left-wing rag. The Economist magazine came out on the 6th of this month, asserting that COP26 didn't even have a concrete plan. And I think when you get to the point where the much beaten down right-wing press start to rebel, when you get to that point, it's game over, right? Because we're literally there, right? If The Economist is calling out COP as not having a concrete plan, then who are we to not back this, to not push this, to not reflect the rest of the world? We need COPs, that go forward with concrete, smart plans. So we put one together. I mentioned this to you before. It's called the COP26 Climate Action Plan. And within it, in summary, we said to everyone, we need to get to a place in time, a point where globally, we are no longer funding new fossil fuel projects. That's new, okay? So the existing ones to keep the system going, keep the lights on at night, stay, but no more new fossil fuel financing. Super important, because if as governments we're all getting together and responding to people's calls for transition to say that we are in transition, actually, it's not true. You can't be in transition if you're still growing the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah.
So we drew a line in the sand and we said, in order to get to that place we want to get to, this is a measurable goal. This is the one thing you can all do, governments. You can all get together and say, right, let's put a stop to this thing. It's killing us. And we're not there yet. Unfortunately, we're not there yet.
And Chidi, final question. What would you do about the massive and disproportionate emissions of the rich?
It's an extremely good question. We've been singing this song for a good part of a decade. We need a global system that pivots towards a polluter pays principle, rather than one that rewards polluters, left, right, and center, with government handouts, with political protection, with dishonest theoretical coverage of what the polluters are actually doing. We need a pivot to a polluter pays principle. If you pollute, especially at large industrial level, you must pay. This is something we cannot compromise on. It's literally a choice between, our lives, our existence, our civilizations, and the ability of the rich to pay for the damage they've done so that we can correct it. And I bear no grudge against people who have achieved things in their lives, who've become wealthy through legitimate, means. But I think that if you become wealthy via a means that we know is brutally unsustainable because it creates problems for the future generations to handle, you should literally step forward and say, with this wealth, I want to help repair humanity. And it has to be done in an unselfish way. Because at the end of the day, our children, our friends, our legacy, our knowledge, our place in time and space depends on our ability to live in a way that is respectful of the situation, the system that created us in the first place. It's very difficult. It's hard not to become emotional about it, because I find it very difficult to understand how a human being, any being actually, can deliberately set out to destroy the environment that enabled it to exist in the first place. It's the weirdest murder-death pact you could ever imagine. And asking for it to stop should not be an act of revolution. It's an act of common sense.
Chidi, thank you so much. I massively appreciate it. And it's been a really great program. Thank you to all three of my wonderful guests, Chidi, Sophie, and Esther, who have just really knocked it out of the park for us. Thank you very much to all of you for listening to Monbiosis. And please join us and stick with us, actually, for the rest of COP26.tv. Thank you.